Howdy folks, welcome back to the channel. Today we're saddling up for a journey back in time, to the dusty trails and sun-scorched towns of the American West. When we think of the Wild West, names like Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, and Jesse James immediately come to mind. These figures have become larger than life, their stories etched into the very mythology of America. But what happened when the dust settled, when the six-shooters were holstered for good, and the so-called Wild West era came to a close around the turn of the 20th century? Who was the last one standing? Today, we're on a quest to find the last survivor of the Wild West legends. Now, defining legend is tricky. Are we talking about the most famous outlaw? The last living lawman from a legendary shootout, or just someone who lived through that era and had a story to tell? For our journey, let's consider the figures whose names are synonymous with the period. The gunslingers, lawmen, and outlaws who defined the age. Let's start with the big names. The infamous Jesse James was gunned down in 1882. Billy the Kid met his end a year earlier in 1881. The legendary lawman Wyatt Earp, however, lived a surprisingly long life. After the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881, he moved around, eventually settling in California. He became a consultant for early Hollywood westerns, sharing his first-hand accounts with directors and actors. Imagine that. The man who actually stood in Tombstone was helping shape its cinematic legacy. Wyatt Earp passed away peacefully in Los Angeles in 1929, at the ripe old age of 80. By the time of his death, the world was a completely different place. Cars had replaced horses, and silent films were giving way to talkies. Earp outlived nearly all of his contemporaries, making him a strong contender for our title. But what about the other side of the law? Let's talk about the Outlaws. The famous Dalton gang was all but wiped out during their disastrous raid on two banks in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1892. However, one member, Emmett Dalton, survived despite being shot over 20 times. He was captured, sentenced to life in prison, but was pardoned after 14 years. What did he do with his second chance? He got married, moved to California, a popular destination for retired Westerners, it seems, and just like Wyatt Earp, he got into the movie business. He wrote a book about the gang's exploits called Beyond the Law, and even acted in a film based on his life. Emmett Dalton lived until 1937, passing away at the age of 66. He outlived Earp by 8 years, witnessing the Great Depression and the rumblings of World War II. So, is Emmett Dalton our last survivor? Not so fast. There's another figure, perhaps less of a household name than Earp, but just as steeped in the lore of the West. Her name was Josephine Sarah Marcus, and she was Wyatt Earp's common-law wife for nearly 50 years. She was there with him through the boom and bust of Tombstone, the move to California, and everything in between. While not a gunslinger herself, she was an integral part of the Earp story, a living link to the events at the OK Corral. She fiercely protected Wyatt's legacy after his death, working to ensure his story was told the way she believed it should be. Josephine lived on until 1944, passing away at the age of 83. Think about that. A woman who lived in the heart of the Wild West lived long enough to see the D-Day landings in Normandy. Her life spanned two entirely different worlds, but we can go even further. Let's dig deeper into the world of the Outlaws. Remember the Wild Bunch, the gang led by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? While the leaders famously met their end in South America, other members lived on. One of the lesser-known members was a woman named Laura Bullion, also known as the Rose of the Wild Bunch. She was a skilled horse rider and played a role in the gang's train robberies. She was eventually arrested in 1901 and served a few years in prison. After her release, she completely reinvented herself. She moved to Memphis, Tennessee, adopted a new name, and lived a quiet life as a seamstress and interior designer. No one in her new life knew she had once ridden with some of the most notorious outlaws in American history. Laura Bullion passed away in 1961. That's right, 1961. She lived to see the dawn of the space age and the presidency of John F. Kennedy. It's almost impossible to imagine someone who robbed trains with Butch Cassidy living in the same era as the Beatles. So, who is the true last survivor? If we're talking about the most iconic top-tier legend, Wyatt Earp held that title for a long time. If we consider those who rode on the wild side, Emmett Dalton and Laura Bullion lived even longer, with Bullion's story being particularly astounding. But there's one more person we need to talk about, someone whose claim is perhaps the most compelling of all. His name was Frank "Pistol Pete" Eaton. As a young boy, Frank witnessed his father, a lawman, get gunned down by a group of former Confederates. Before his father died, he made young Frank promise to avenge him, and so at the age of 15, armed with a pistol and a burning desire for justice, he set out. He was taught to handle a gun by a family friend and became known for his incredible speed and accuracy. Over the next few years, he tracked down, and by his own account, killed the men responsible for his father's death. He served as a U.S. Deputy Marshal and saw the last days of the true frontier. After his quest for revenge was complete, he settled down in Oklahoma, got married, and lived a relatively normal life. But he never lost his connection to the Old West. He became a living embodiment of the cowboy spirit. He wrote his autobiography, Pistol Pete, veteran of the Old West, and became a local celebrity. He was even the living mascot for what is now Oklahoma State University, his iconic cowboy image becoming their Pistol Pete mascot that is still used today. Frank Eaton lived an incredibly long life, passing away in 1958 at the age of 97. Think about that for a moment. A man who engaged in gunfights and served as a marshal in the 1870s and 80s lived to see the rise of rock and roll and the beginning of the Cold War. He outlived Wyatt Earp by nearly 3 decades. So, while Laura Bullion may have outlived him by 3 years, her story was one of hiding from her past. Frank Eaton, on the other hand, embraced his. He was a walking, talking piece of history, a direct link to the gunslinging era who proudly carried that identity until his final day. He wasn't just a survivor of the Wild West. He was its living memory. The story of the Wild West didn't end with a final shootout. It faded away, person by person, until only the memories and the legends remained. Figures like Wyatt Earp, Emmett Dalton, and especially Frank Eaton served as bridges between 2 ages, reminding us that the larger-than-life characters of history were real people who lived, loved, and eventually grew old. Their long lives prove that sometimes the greatest act of survival isn't winning a gunfight, but simply living long enough to tell the tale. Thanks so much for riding along with me on this journey into the past. It's a fascinating piece of history, isn't it? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more deep dives into forgotten stories. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next adventure. Until next time, stay curious.